We're going to get started now. Gave a little bit of time for people because of the weather. We're going to go ahead and get into discussion now. So we'll have an event pretty straightforward. First, we'll be having Juliet here speak briefly about the ongoing women's movement in the U.S., but also globally, and then followed up by Ginger Jentzen, and I'll be introducing the both of them just before they speak. After that, we'll be having a discussion period where people can come in from the crowd. If you just raise your hand, I can put you on what we call a stack, and that'll allow you to, well, I'll just call on you as people are done speaking. And I think we'll allow for the speakers up here to kind of engage in discussion throughout that period. So first, Juliet DePaula. She's from Brooklyn, New York, recently moved to Wisconsin. She spoke at the Women's March on behalf of Socialist Alternative and the Socialist Feminist Contingent. Tonight, she's here to speak with us and to talk about how we can continue to build a movement to fight for gender and economic justice.
Thank you. Okay, this is for the sound system. I know that it sounds like it's off. I just wanted to tell you guys that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about where we are right now here and around the world in the women's movement, the overall situation today for women's rights. As the age of austerity arising from the great crash of 2008 entered its second decade, a new movement of women struggling against their oppression is taking shape. And with this, the ideas of socialist feminism are ever more relevant. Feminism is very much popular again. All over the globe, women have been taking to the streets and speaking out about gender oppression. This past November, more than 1.5 million students answered the strike call of Sindicato de Estudiantes and Libres y Combativas. The socialist feminist platform of our sister party in Spain, Izquierda Revolucionaria, against sexism in schools and in the legal system of the Spanish state. In Ireland, Poland, and Argentina, women have organized to defeat new and existing reactionary constraints on their reproductive rights, challenging the stranglehold of the Catholic Church over social issues. In India, just this month, over 3 million women gathered to form a 365-mile wall across Kerala in protest against sexism and religious conservatism, marking a new dawn for feminism in the country. Last month in Israel, as a response to a wave of gender-based murders of women and girls, over 30,000 people took part in an unprecedented day of rage in protest of violence against women, which included strike actions and demonstrations throughout the country. These rallies were particularly significant as a bold Jewish Arab protest, defying the racist divide and rule in Israeli society. Also recently in Scotland, over 8,000 low-paid women working for Glasgow City Council took historic strike action to demand equal pay. Me Too movement has spread around the world, raising awareness of the scourge of sexual harassment, while the elections of Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil have provoked massive movements against the sexism of both presidents and in defense of hard-won rights for women against anticipated attacks. In Brazil, women are playing a crucial role in the LA Now movement against Bolsonaro, who has come to power at a time of devastating economic, social, and political crisis. The democratic rights of women, black Brazilians, the LGBTQ community, indigenous people, and the entire working class are on the line under a Bolsonaro administration. A new women's movement is emerging in the U.S. and internationally in the context of major threats to women's hard-won gains from vicious reactionary forces. Although these are mainly disparate movements and not all countries have been affected in the same way, it would probably not be an exaggeration to say that a third feminist wave is on the move. In the United States, the Me Too campaign brought sexual harassment and assault front and center in society. On top of this, the Great Recession, as well as the attacks from the right, have detonated a series of explosive struggles in recent years. These have politicized many young and working-class women who have been disproportionately affected by the crisis of capitalism. Young women also played a key role in the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, which for many people pointed a way towards a real challenge to the corporate power which benefits from sexism and racism. Even before millions protested the current predator-in-chief, the mood to fight sexism had reached a boiling point. From the slut walk protest to Carry That Weight to #YesAllWomen, young women made clear that they were ready to fight back against sexism and abuse. Millions of women want not only to fight back against their own Weinsteins and Kavanaughs, but to end the endemic sexism which permeates all through all of our lives. The growing labor upsurge in the U.S. has been spearheaded heavily by heavily female workforces, including nurses, teachers, hospitality, and service workers. The teachers' revolt is a revolt against years of a vicious and essentially sexist campaign that sought to blame teachers for society's problems. The teachers in West Virginia, Arizona, Oklahoma, and North Carolina rose up to defend themselves, their students, and their communities. And that fight is continuing, as we've seen in California just this past week, and soon teachers in other states and cities like Denver are set to join in. In the service industry, over 70% of service employees are women. And at McDonald's, it was women leading the fight against sexual harassment when they went on strike. And after lengthy strikes in several cities, union workers at Marriott hotels won stronger language protecting workers against sexual harassment by the guests, as well as strong wage increases. Unions should be, and sometimes are, including demands around sexual harassment in their bargaining. As the right wing continues to carry out attacks on women, LGBTQ people, and people of color, immigrants, unions, and all working people, the new women's movement is faced with decisive questions. How can we fight the right? And how do we build a movement that can both defeat these immediate attacks and go on to win real gains for women? Additionally, who are we fighting for, and how inclusive is this movement? In much of the mass media, feminism over the past decade has been dominated by individualism. This type of feminism celebrates the achievements of wealthy ruling class women like Hillary Clinton and emphasizes that women can take individual action to reach greater heights in their lives and in their work. The feminist CEOs and capitalist politicians want to see more women at the top as they actively work against working class women's interests. The for-profit healthcare system, the severe crisis of housing affordability, low-wage jobs, these factors and more, alongside the rollback of reproductive rights, the threat against Roe v. Wade, with Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court, all contribute to women's oppression. We need to continue to reject a feminism of the elites that is placated by the symbolism of a few token women breaking a glass ceiling. As socialists, we believe that to ultimately achieve women's liberation, we need to build a new society. Most importantly, we believe that this is possible. Every successful struggle that we organize against right-wing attacks on women, LGBTQ people, immigrants, people of color, and unions, and every reform we can win under capitalism builds confidence for working people to unite and fight for our liberation and an egalitarian socialist world. This is why it is so important to have concrete, clear demands for people to rally around from a feminist lens. The need for affordable housing is a feminist issue. The need for free, high-quality health care is a feminist issue. The need for fair wages is a feminist issue. And with that, I will pass it to Ginger, who will talk about these demands a little more, why they are important, and how we build that fight.
Thank you, Juliet, very much. So next up is Ginger Jentzen, who is a member of Socialist Alternative. She was the executive director for 15 Now Minnesota and led the movement to win $15 an hour in the first city in the Midwest, which was also just won in St. Paul as a result of that work. Ginger ran for city council following that as a member of SA and narrowly lost, but dominated the housing conversation by raising demands for rent control and making the big developers pay for it. She raised the most money of small donations from working people, refusing any from big developers who dominate the city hall. She's continuing to organize it to build a movement for rent control in Minneapolis now. Please welcome Ginger.
All right. Hey, thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm really excited to be in Madison. I haven't spent a whole lot of time here, but it's been really fun to get to discuss with people here about the potential to organize around similar issues as working people are facing in Minneapolis, which I think says a lot about the moment we're in and a lot about like much of what Juliet touched on. I think when we're talking about what it looks like to organize as socialists, and what it looks like to try and win real gains within the context of an emerging new women's movement, I think we're talking about being extremely concrete, right? Like a lot of stuff that Juliet pointed to about, you know, just even the phrase that affordable housing is a feminist issue. What exactly does that mean? To me, that means we're only going to win affordable housing for ordinary people along all lines if we are fighting in a united movement around trying to win things like rent control, making big developers pay, making sure that we're taxing the rich to build the affordable housing we need and not further burdening ordinary working class people. And I think over the past period, drawing from the economic crisis, that began in 2008, like this is still a continuing set of issues that people are facing, right? The recovery has really only been for the top 1%. Wall Street is warning of another impending economic crisis, but rich people got richer, poor people got poorer, working class people were faced with more crises, and we haven't gotten affordable health care still, right? Like, who stood in the way of these movements? Who stood in the way of Medicare for all in California? It was corporate Democrats, right? So like the reality of who's fighting for us is really the solidarity amongst working class people, and that translates into what does it look like to actually win real racial and gender justice under capitalism. The fact that we have 3 billionaires who own more wealth than the bottom half of the U.S. population says a lot about what it's actually going to take to win when it comes to trying to have real equality in our workplace, what it means about trying to fight for a federal $15 minimum wage as it relates to the gender pay gap. This isn't about just trying to push a few people to the forefront or turning it into like, women of color or Native American women only make 60 cents on the dollar for every man. No, like I don't want to just fight over who gets 30 cents less. I want to say real equality means we make a living wage. We have rent that we can afford. We have a really decent quality of life. And to me, that means not just fighting over piecemeal issues, like a lot of the leadership in the current women's movement. That means fighting on the line of what does it look like to have real solidarity, all genders, fighting inclusively together in a movement that's actually going to achieve the type of justice that working class people really need. And I think it's no mystery that when it comes to climate action, when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, when it comes to the fight for 15, it has predominantly been women and people of color at the forefront of these movements because we are the ones most disproportionately pushed into low-wage jobs, most disproportionately realizing what it means to have, the racism of climate justice, right? Where people in the city are being pushed to and facing the worst air quality, et cetera. I think this is a section, and these are sections of the working class that are being described as, I think, the most ready to fight in a lot of ways, but also are, being pushed into a situation where the type of leadership necessary means actually putting forward a strategy that is going to be both militant and ready to challenge the leadership and the misleadership that we've experienced in these movements up to a certain point, right? And this is part of why, for me at least, I'm a socialist activist. There's a growing openness to socialist ideas in U.S. society, and especially amongst young people. And I think that that's because of the experience growing up under a crisis of climate change, growing up under a Wall Street crisis, basically, growing up under a recession. A lot of young people, I think, are being pulled into the struggle on different issues. I think in a lot of ways it was a qualitative change in the movement against gun violence to have Parkland students come out and say no more to school shootings and draw solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement that had been raising those demands over several years in working class black communities across the U.S. I think that shows the need to link up broad sections of the working class and really be explicit about the links between various forms of inequality and oppression that we experience under the capitalist system. But the leadership, I think, on offer has pointed toward these piecemeal solutions and don't fundamentally challenge the status quo. And that's where I think the idea of really putting forward a socialist strategy for how to address these issues is incredibly important. I think without Socialist Alternative playing the role that we did in Minneapolis around the $15 minimum wage, we wouldn't have won it. We wouldn't have won as strong a proposal as we did. We worked in solidarity and in coalition with a number of other groups that were doing organizing and doing the Fight for 15 kind of fast food worker organizing, and trying to build up for days of strike action and that type of thing. But really, we were very sharp and very clear about the need to go out into the community and fight around 15 in a union, and to be very clear about the role that City Hall was playing. In Minneapolis, we have an entirely Democratic Party-dominated City Hall. It is viewed as a very progressive City Hall. Even the last administration, now we have a new City Hall that's viewed as even more progressive, and they're even more in the way when it comes to fighting for affordable housing. But this is the consciousness that we're contending with, right, as we're trying to organize. We need to point out the fact and create situations where it's very clear who is and isn't on the side of working people, who is or isn't on the side of working class people of color, who is or isn't on the side of working class women, as we're fighting around the need for a living wage, the need to have access to universal health care, the need to have access to universal child care, the need to be able to be, active in our own communities because we aren't burdened by the, housework at home, or by trying to create meals, or by, trying to have access to child care that is increasingly expensive. And I think that's really good that Juliet pointed out, this is not glass ceiling feminism, right? Like, actually doing organizing in the streets is going to take, I think, really discussing out what demands our movement is for. And I think it's really good that we're linking up, or at least this banner back here, the Medicare for All with full reproductive and LGBTQ care. I think this is an important part of ways in which we can draw solidarity across like different movements and not looking at it as single issue. I think it's also extremely exciting that what we're talking about is strike action as a tactic back on the agenda in a way that it hasn't been in the past. To see Marriott workers coming out basically saying that they wouldn't tolerate any more sexual harassment in the workplace. In a workplace where a lot of women are isolated and not necessarily seeing each other, and so in very kind of precarious circumstances and potentially very vulnerable to sexual assault or harassment. At the same time as you see Google workers, workers who are far more high paid, but it was an all-gender walkout. It was an all-gender solidarity set of strike actions that took place that actually, I think was drawing connection between inequality in pay as much as it was talking about inequality in, sexual assault, right? Like the fact that they were incensed at the idea that there were tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars in payouts going to these executives for having settled cases of sexual assault and harassment while they don't have health care, or while they don't have like real packages. I think the next step would be talking about organizing in those workplaces and actually, fighting for a union and representation. But that was a huge step in my mind to show that, like, in the working class there are different sections that are actually needing to walk out and stand together to be able to fight for our own needs. And of course, the McDonald's workers. The first strike action we've seen since a lot of these 15 for a union protests, as 15 has been won in different cities, has been on the issue of sexual assault. And this was based on committees coming together and talking about what would it take to actually be able to pressure the company to actually move forward in developing different proposals around sexual assault. Some of this stuff might seem small from a company like McDonald's, who has been fought over the years and maybe hasn't given up too much, but it's a step in the direction of what do social movements have in common with workplace actions. And as a tactic, what does strike actually mean? And what could it mean if we actually pointed toward one-day strike actions that involved workers across all sectors? We had members, I won't say that. So in Minneapolis last year, we hosted the Super Bowl, and there was a lot of discussion about what role could an action around the Super Bowl play in actually calling attention to the fact that we are losing affordable housing increasingly by the day. Communities of color and working class communities in Minneapolis are being displaced constantly. And a lot of it was with the view of getting U.S. Bank Stadium built, with the view of getting a beautiful city set for Super Bowl attendees, really rich people who could afford to go. And then now we have the NCAA's Final Four coming. We have the X Games year after year. Our mayor loves the X Games. All of these things are sort of prestige projects for the city to show off what a beautiful place we are. And yet we still have an increasing homelessness crisis because because people are being priced out of their, housing, and yet the city is standing firmly in the way of something like rent control, or refuses to discuss even the idea of taxing the rich to build affordable housing. They love the idea of talking about something like inclusionary zoning, which even Bill de Blasio in New York says doesn't actually work in keeping people in their homes. I don't know if Juliet could speak to that, but it's the type of policy that looks really good on paper, but it's lip service to not actually challenging the donors to the Democratic Party or standing in the way of some like the GOP and Trump, and really standing up in the way that requires real leadership. So I have a few more small points to make, but I think in terms of the question of leadership and mass action and what strategies and tactics to be able to win, I think right now we're seeing people are responding really well to bold and audacious proposals. What if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood up and said, we're going to do a one-day action to stop the government shutdown, to basically say no to Trump's racist, bigoted wall, no money for the wall, full compensation for all furloughed federal employees. What if we had looked to the Women's March? What if leaders like Ocasio-Cortez had looked to the Women's March and said, this is going to be a day of action across all of these different issues, not just about solidarity amongst working class women and calling attention to the fact that we need to, within this women's movement, actually build actions that are going to, bring about real equality, but actually challenging the system on a whole and standing up to the Democratic Party establishment to say, we won't accept any sort of deal that you're, supposedly going to make in the back rooms with Trump. The reason I think that they haven't made one so far is because of the popularity of people like Ocasio-Cortez, but what if she put forward real leadership? I think not all strategies are created equal, and I think we could have a really good discussion about that. What I think I'm advocating for in the overall, and what I think we did and achieved with the 15 Now campaign in Minneapolis and then subsequently in St. Paul, was really, it's about having faith in organizing people on the basis of the working class being able to change society and really be able to run society in a better way. It's not about developing better relationships with the halls of power. And I think it's about looking to what types of independent structures can we build that actually advocate for our own interests. In a lot of ways, I think, within broader movements, sometimes that sounds sort of pie in the sky, but I think we can realize it when we point back to history, when we point back to how the women's movement, the civil rights movement, how things have been achieved in the past, and how any real mass movement goes beyond what's acceptable, I think, to what the Democratic Party is willing to fight for. I don't think we need to sort of account for our demands on the basis of what they're willing to accept, or even, in terms of what sort of the left wing of the Democratic Party is willing to fight for right now. They will be pushed based on what type of movement comes together and how much we're able to organize and put forward a set of clear demands that deal with what we actually need, when it comes to the fight for Medicare for all, when it comes to fighting for things that are concrete, that can win more people to the broader project of, I think, eliminating sexism in the workplace and really developing, an independent party for working people in the United States where we can debate about how to really build an engine of change in our society and the type of leadership it's going to take. The last example I'll really give is in our member Shama Sawant in Seattle and the way that she's been able to use her office. She's an elected council member in the city of Seattle as a member of Socialist Alternative. And really, that office is an organizing tool. It's constantly in motion. It is constantly about raising up the demands of working people in the city. It's about trying to win concrete gains. And in particular, she led on organizing in the city and really forced the hand of the council to pass a tax on Amazon that was linked to building affordable housing and dealing with the crisis of homelessness in the city of Seattle. The liberal establishment on the city council came under such pressure from Amazon and big business in the city that within 4 weeks they repealed the tax, despite the fact that Shama spoke against it, despite the fact she voted against the repeal, all of these things. There's no good reason that they eliminated that tax against Amazon except for the fact of the pressure of big business, except for the fact of they were afraid of what that meant for their careers going forward and what that meant in terms of the city of Seattle relationship with business, right? We do not need large corporations like Amazon to continue to rule over everyone's lives, pay poverty wages, provide no health care, and have their CEO be the greatest billionaire in all of history of capitalism. That disproportionate inequality is, I think, the nature of the problem. And I think as socialist activists, often I think we put forward the best solutions for the shortest distance between 2 points. If that level of inequality exists, I think it's very clear what needs to be done to be able to defeat it. And to me, that's like building up the type of movement that we've seen in the past that has won union rights, that has won the right to the 8-hour day, that has won victories against sexual harassment in the workplace. And I think that that's like working class representatives like Shama Sawant are the type of thing, I mean, as far as we're going to engage, with trying to run our own candidates and building up the type of independent movements that we need, I think that's a great example. I think we should talk more in this discussion about, what type of change is really necessary. I'd really appeal to, discussing more about what type of organizing you all are doing in Madison, and what it's going to take to actually achieve real change in the U.S. and so beyond even your immediate communities, but what type of work we can be doing to really combat the type of sexism that we've seen broadly as a result of capitalism and the racism of the capitalist system, and how it can really, I think, in a positive way, be combated by a fight for socialism. So that's what I'll say. Thanks.